Thank you for being here. Thank you for people walking by and having a look over here, maybe staying 15 minutes to hear what we have to say. We want to talk about culture and disaster risk reduction. We're a group of anthropologists, sociologists, social scientists, and practitioners, and we're part of a network that we call Culture and Action Disaster Network. And so Culture and Disaster Action Network, sorry about that. And we want to thank National Science Foundation in the US, and we want to thank American Anthropological Association in the US for helping us get here. What we are here to talk about is a culture-based DRR approach. And we believe that this is something that could represent the next frontier, really, of effective, successful DRR practice. Whoops. Very quick remote here. So just looking at this slide, every human group and every human being is influenced by cultural factors that shape their decisions and viewpoints. So this is a really important fundamental concept in social science today, and that is that all groups have culture. This is not something that is relegated to just indigenous people. It's not something that we find with just developing societies or non-Western people. Western white people have culture too. And so do organizations and institutions that are staffed by people from the West. So recognizing that cultural embeddedness in all groups is really one way we can do better in DRR. So here's a cartoon. I don't know if you can read, but you have a woman in a swimsuit from the West, probably the US, and a woman in a burqa from the Middle East. And they both are saying something about each other that happens to sound a lot alike. The woman in the bikini is looking back at the woman in the burqa, saying, "Everything covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture." And the woman in the burqa, "Nothing covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture." These kinds of cultural clashes say something about what it is we have to work with, how much we need to understand each other's points of views and deeply embedded cultures in order to move forward and do better. So that's why understanding cultural traditions, context, and values can make all the difference in whether DRR initiatives are accepted and applied. Here's an example of a failed DRR project. This is a project that occurred after the tsunami in 2004 in Thailand, where 300 plus homes were built 2 kilometers from the shoreline. This is a completely abandoned village. What people took into account was the structural mitigation of risk factors. They took into account the need to protect assets, but they did not take into account cultural considerations. They didn't bring people into the decision making, and this is fundamentally an omission. So what they did consider is important and necessary, but it's not enough. And all that wasted money and effort and resources has really helped spur more organizations to come and think about putting people first, making culture a part of the program. But culture is interpreted in a lot of different ways. So let's look at specifically how one of those ways is happening right now today. In 2012, UNESCO created an approach that's called culture as a sector approach. Many of you are familiar with this, I'm sure. And here you have cultural heritage sites, you have heritage assets, you have creative goods like arts, crafts, foods that are understood to be protected and need to be preserved. And these are also important and necessary kinds of contributions to the DRR practice, but they are not enough. So here again, we see that culture cannot be bound to a sector. It's more than a sector. It's not just what's visible, it's not just what's material or audible, it's more than those things, and it's also not discrete. So this is a graphic that we created to try to communicate what it is we're talking about, how much more culture really is. So you think about how people think about things, how people come to their certain beliefs about all kinds of things, how to raise children, how to take care of the elderly, how to think about their relationship to nature. All kinds of values, what is food, are part of that shared understandings that constitutes the glue, the social connection, the tissue that really identifies one group and their sense of belonging to each other from another group. What about risk? Perceptions of risk cannot be isolated from other kinds of perceptions. They're built into a cultural system of knowledge that has to be taken into account in its wholeness. So we see, in fact, that culture permeates, shapes, and defines so much of everything we're trying to accomplish with respect to the physical, economic, and social environment. So we have to take culture at its face value. And when people come in with their own cultural assumptions and their own cultural expectations as organizations that have their own culture, they have to recognize that that's contributing to what might be a mismatch between their culture and the local culture. So it's not just a matter of understanding what's local, understanding oneself and one's own institutional culture is also critical. So what is culture-based DRR? With a culturally based DRR approach, proven models, strategies, and ways of practicing best practices are the starting points, and those get adapted to local context. That's what we're talking about. And this is the graphic that can hopefully convey what it is we're suggesting, which is not just putting people first, not just putting people at the center, but making culture the operative concept so that we understand these cultural needs. And this is how we believe that people can be all included. So we're looking at the cultural needs to include people who are vulnerable, people who are elderly, women and children, ethnic subgroups, religious subgroups. So culture is also needs to be understood as infused in all these traditional approaches that can include human assets, natural assets, physical assets, social assets, and financial assets. So culture is infusing those things. They're not separate from each other, and they're not separate from culture. So a culturally informed approach focuses on these shared understandings that underlie how communities perceive and respond to risk and recover from disaster. And this is what we're promoting in methodologies that we believe will deliver success, because we understand that so many groups now want to do something like this. They want to put people at the center, and we're suggesting that a cultural approach is the most effective, robust way to achieve that. Through cultural knowledge, we can get more successful. We can have more predictable success. We can also recognize that the role of culture is to embody respect, dignity, participation, partnership, and a sense of ownership among local groups, so that we are effectively saying we're interested in supporting the humanity of other people. That's fundamentally what this is about. And now Adam Kuntz is going to talk to us about a couple of examples that he has had specific experience with.
So as an example of how we think culture can be and should be utilized in programs, we have two examples that we think are a good representation of how cultural analysis was used and the results that it achieved in DRR programs. The first one was in Afghanistan as a agricultural recovery resilience DRR program for food security, and we did an analysis of the cultural the cultural situation in the communities before we started the design process. We found that people would accept assistance, but they would refuse to accept charity. They're very pride, they're very self-sufficient. They put a lot of importance on their own capacity to make agricultural decisions, not to be given something and then be forced to use it. They had existing social and economic systems. They had relationships between farmers and merchants and buyers and sellers already. And the community itself knew who was suffering most, who was most vulnerable, and the community had their own structures for decision making. So utilizing that analysis, the program that was designed was an agricultural voucher program. So instead of just giving a decided number of seeds or tools or implements, the agricultural vouchers could be used for anything. So they were not given to everybody. The community decided the criteria that would be utilized to award vouchers. The vouchers could be used for anything, so that implied the farmers' decision making and agricultural expertise. Very importantly, there was a 15% copay. So the farmers weren't getting charity. They were paying for the vouchers at a reduced cost. And they felt that pride of ownership and that pride that they really are taking care of their agricultural needs. And then they could pool the vouchers so a few families could get together and buy farm machinery. So that was another way that they used cooperation that existed at the community level. And also we used local vendors. We didn't want to interrupt the agricultural trade and commerce and relationships that had been developed over a long, long time. And the training was optional. We weren't forcing people. We weren't saying you don't know agriculture well enough, so you have to take training. We would like to train you in drought-resistant agriculture if you choose to. Otherwise, you get the voucher anyway. So there's a lot of choice built in and a lot of local decision-making built in. The second example, and I'm going to race through this because I'm running out of time, was drought DRR in Somaliland, Ethiopia, where communities did have their own traditional water resource management and reservoirs that had fallen into disrepair because in subsequent droughts, NGOs and the government had brought in water tanks and water tanker trucks. And so we reverted back to their original design and improved it. So what we did is we made their original water catchment systems stronger, larger, more durable, and we made an improvement. Let me go back a moment. The biggest problem with the original systems was evaporation. So we added a roof. And the roof also prevents recontamination. Anyhow, those are the things that we did. What we'd like to take a look at is why doesn't everybody use cultural analysis? Why isn't every single project done using cultural analysis? Well, there are a few reasons. Some of us, experts, have a narrow definition of what we think culture is and how it should be used. We have time pressures. We have to design programs really fast. We don't have time for cultural analysis. Or we've been working there a long, long time. We already know the culture. Why ask more questions? And culture is really, really complicated. We'll never understand it well enough, so let's just move on. There are packages, best practices. Let's just use a package we already have and adapt it a tiny bit. There are policies, and we bring in our own perspectives. There are assumptions that we have when we go into a community. So we don't want to do this. We don't want to, again, parachute in and hand over a design. And you all recognize that. I've been in that basket. So how can we increase the use of culture? What we're saying is, all those reasons, it's not impossible. We can build on existing systems that utilize culture in design and analysis. We can do tailored data collection. We can make sure we collect cultural data using any number of methodologies that social scientists use. We can do the analysis properly, and we can ensure that policies and strategies insist that there's cultural analysis before you get funding and before you move ahead. And of course, we can improve on local partnerships.
And that's what we wanted to communicate. And we want to ask you to feel welcome to contact us. We're interested, as our network, Culture and Disaster Action Network, to partner and collaborate with people who are interested in mobilizing and advancing the cause of real dignity and humanity for people by including a cultural-based approach. So you can contact us. We have handouts that we can make available. Please feel free to contact us, and we would be happy to hear from you. Thank you so much for your time and attention.